with the miracles. Our guest this hour is Dr. Stacy Trasancos. Dr. Trasancos has a PhD from Penn State University in what's that called? Chemistry. Oh, yeah. And a master's in dogmatic theology from Holy Apostles College. She's the author of Science Was Born of Christianity, the teaching of Father Stanley Yaki, and the very popular Particles of Faith, a Catholic guide to navigating science. She's now also the executive director and chief High Muckety Muck of the St. Philip Institute of Catechesis and Evangelization. Hello, Dr. Trasancos. Thanks for being with us.
Hello, Cy. It's great to be back on the show again.
So that's a new title for you. Can you just tell us something about what do you do there? I mean, not you as the executive director, but what does the Institute do? St. Philip Institute of Catechesis and Evangelization.
Well, Bishop Strickland wrote a constitution on teaching where he said we need to simply teach the faith. And so instead of just having different departments within the chancery, he started an entire institute that is charged with that mission to teach the Catholic faith to the people of East Texas. He wants us to teach the faith in general, but he insists that we focus on the people of East Texas. In other words, take the shining truths off the hill and bring them down in a communicable way to the people who live here in East Texas. So he started the Institute with this constitution. And my job as executive director with the other directors is to do what he tells us to do, to teach on the liturgy, the virtues, catechesis, make materials for parents who are raising children. We're communicating specifically to 7 different seasons of life so that we are teaching the faith. That's what it's all about. And everything we do goes through that mission statement.
That is exciting. That's exciting work.
It's characteristically simple and elegant, the way Bishop Strickland does everything. I mean, he doesn't want us to complicate anything, just teach it. So yeah, it's like a breath of fresh air to be doing something like this, because I guess, I had come to the conclusion a long time ago as a Catholic that the most important thing you can do any day of your life is to get yourself to heaven and lead other people to heaven too. Like, that matters more than anything. And it's fun and great and exciting to have a job where that is what I'm supposed to be doing. And we have the staff here. They're all young, Orthodox, enthusiastic, talented people. So
sounds like Catholic answers.
I'm loving it.
Although we're not all young here. We're not all young. The hardworking ones are. 888-318-7884 is our number here if you'd like to talk with Dr. Trasancos about Eucharistic miracles. 888-318-7884. Anyone welcome to pick up the phone and dial that number. I don't want to make too many delays here, but Particles of Faith, your book, your kind of guide for Catholics is, for how do we navigate this new world of science that we're living in? And it seems like it's a newer all the time. Well, I guess it is. Everything is. But I mean, it's an ever-expanding new world of science. How do we navigate that as Catholics? Something's happening with that book.
Yes, I'm so excited. When I wrote the book, I wrote it with young people in mind. But now it's been rewritten. So I've rewritten it specifically in language appropriate for teenagers. I've explained a little more of the science, more of the theology, but it's been rewritten into a student edition. So Particles of Faith, student edition. It's a textbook that Catholic high school religion and science teachers can use to either do a 4, an 8, or a 16-week course to teach their students how to navigate the scientific issues. And what's unique about it, as you know from the book, is it has a lot of science in it. So it has the science that the students are going to be learning in biology, chemistry, and physics classes. And it even points beyond that to what they might learn if they study science in college or become scientists. And the fundamental line for the whole book is that science is the study of the handiwork of God. And so once students get through with this course, they will never be confused by that false narrative that's so rampant in our society today, that faith and science are in conflict. It's totally, I don't want to just refute that conflict myth. I want them to get past it and to actually lead scientific progress, because they know how to practice virtue and live the Christian life. They understand what it's all about. So Catholics are the ones who should be leading scientific progress.
Again, do you know what I mean by that? Leading scientific progress?
Yeah, again. Yeah. Science was, yes, exactly.
Because it all started in the Catholic Church. But you probably know that, having written a book entitled that Science is Born of Christianity, or I paraphrase the title, but...
No, that's the title.
Did I say it right?
Based on Father Yaki's teaching. Yeah, and I look at it like this, like, okay, I have to tell you, next year I'm going to have 4 teenage girls in the house, because 4 of my daughters will all be teenagers at the same time in 2020. But I sort of look at science as this adolescent who, science was born of Christianity, and then science grew up really fast and became independent. And we're at a point in time now where science needs to come back in a more mature way to its mother and seek her guidance. So I like the future of science. I see it not totally being what it was in the medieval times, but a more mature science with all we know about the quantum and the atomic realm and materials chemistry, something that is reintegrated with philosophy and theology and directed in a way that science actually benefits humanity.
Man, Richard Dawkins is not going to like this. He is not going to like that. That is a magnificent vision. And of course, it's in a very basic way, it has to happen, because you can't even continue a very reasonable pursuit based only on reason. A human being is much more than that, and eventually will break down and do horrible things, like maybe blow up the world, if we don't behave not just as reasoning, but also as moral and spiritual creatures. But okay, so here you are, this big-time scientist. Now you've got the fancy title, and why are we here today to talk about Eucharistic miracles? You're not embarrassed of this idea of miracles?
No, not at all. Actually, so I'm fine with miracles. The way Father Stanley Yaki put it, that I love the best, is if God created everything, if God created at the atomic level even all the electrons whizzing around in their atoms, in their quantum mechanically defined orbitals, doing their thing so precisely. I mean, if God can create all of that and hold it all in existence right now, then of course God can choose to work miracles, and of course it makes sense that God would suspend the laws of nature for the benefit of our salvation, because that's why we believe God works miracles. He does it not on a whim, but he does it when there is a cause to benefit the salvation of someone, of a person or groups of people. And so that's the most logical conclusion in the world, is that if God can hold everything in existence created with order like it is, he certainly could go beyond that order and work miracles. So intellectually, miracles are reasonable. What I sort of got stumped on, I mean, I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I'll just be honest. When it was sort of like an abstract idea, it was like, okay, but I was sort of afraid to look into the scientific research around the Eucharistic miracles. Not so much that I don't think miracles could happen, but so much because I'm not really sure who I can believe. Like, what if people were not doing the scientific analysis thoroughly? What if they were biased in their conclusions? I just almost didn't want to know. Mm-hmm. But the bishop asked us to look at a video of a miracle in Buenos Aires that a local cardiovascular surgeon here, who's Catholic and very good friends with the bishop, sent him, because his daughter sent it to him. And they were very excited about it. And so I looked at this miracle, the Eucharistic miracles in Argentina, and I started looking into it, and I thought, you know what, maybe I should give a talk or something on this. And I put together a talk, and I looked more into the data, and I still had that feeling that I'm going to be up there giving this talk, and I'm just going to say that I'm reading what's in a book here. Yeah. But I had this uneasiness because I thought, I really still would like to see, I don't want somebody to say, this is what the analysis said. I want to see the results for myself. I want to be the scientist going, I think you could interpret it another way. Maybe it doesn't really say what you're thinking, like let there be a debate. And I didn't have the scientific reports. Bishop Strickland emails me from Australia, where he was visiting January 22nd, and he says, guess what, Stacy? I met a man named Ron Tesoriero outside of a small church in Sydney while I was visiting here. He says he was the man who was sent to Buenos Aires to investigate the miracle, to record all the scientists doing their investigation. He has all these materials, including the scientific analysis right here in this book. I'm going to mail them to you. And so they were just sitting on my desk, all because I'm like, God, I'd really like to see the analysis. Boom. It comes to me from Australia.
Isn't that just like him, Stacy? I love the fact that it took kind of a miracle. Like, why is your bishop in Australia, and why does he run into a guy who did the original studies on this right at the moment where you're asking yourself, is this really science? Can I trust this? So you needed a miracle to be convinced of a miracle, basically, is what happened.
Yeah, it's sort of like one of those times you're like, okay, God, I get it. I will look at the data.
Well, fair enough. We have lots of folks on the line, and I also want you to tell us a bit about, okay, so what is that Eucharistic miracle in Buenos Aires, and what are maybe some of the other Eucharistic miracles? We'll get to all of that when we come back. Our store-wide, spring sale is underway right now. We've got new resources from, the wonderful new book from Don Eden, Jimmy Aiken, Trent Horn. Promo code SPRING19 at checkout. Save 15% off store-wide right now at shop.catholic.com.
Your questions, Catholic Answers Live.
Catholic Answers Live is proudly supported by CatholicChemistry.com, a new dating site for Catholics who want to do dating right and believe relationships start with Catholic chemistry. Catholic Answers Live thanks CatholicChemistry.com for their generous support on the web at CatholicChemistry.com.
Underwriting for Catholic Answers Live is provided by Real Estate for Life. Real Estate for Life connects home buyers and sellers to real estate agents while supporting pro-life organizations. On the web at realestateforlife.org.
EWTN, Teaching the Truth.
I had called in last spring about talking to my parents, and I was going to convert to the church and how to talk to them. They were not happy at all, but I was confirmed to the church at the Easter Vigil service, and we really don't talk about the topic, but our relationship is still intact, so that's a good thing. Just wanted to say thank you, and I still listen every day because I always learn something new.
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. A lot to be happy about around here. We love when the new babies come, and got lots of young people here, so we do end up getting good news about babies every now and then here at Catholic Answers, and that's always good. But I will just confess, this is my favorite work day of the year, the first day of daylight savings time. I love driving home, and it's still sunny out. Is that totally self-centered? I don't know, but I just love it. So I'm in a great mood. Plus, Dr. Stacy Trasancos is here, who by some freak I have not gotten to speak to for a long time, and I think that the freakish thing that happened is I probably blew it at several points. So I'm glad to have you back. We're talking about Eucharistic miracles today. Dr. Trasancos is a PhD chemist who once explained to an entire room full of Catholics how photosynthesis works, and I don't think any of us understood it, but it was awfully impressive to see what God was doing in every single leaf on the planet Earth. So you talked about how there's this Eucharistic miracle in Buenos Aires. Your bishop was kind of prompting you to share this with people as an aid to faith, which is what it's supposed to be. You were a little reluctant, given you didn't know the data on this thing. Okay, so God works his somewhat generally charming, miraculous ways, gets you that data. So now you believe in Eucharistic miracles, big-time scientist. So tell us what happened there in Buenos Aires.
Right. So in Buenos Aires, this was a miracle that happened 1992, 1994, and 1996. And just so you can see, I'm reading from this book, Eucharistic Miracles of the World. It's the best book I've found on them because it has a lot of details in it. But on 3 separate occasions, there were consecrated hosts found that were oozing blood. And so there was a fairly good amount of sample then. And so when each one of them was found on the floor, they were picked up, and the standard procedure is to put them in water and then store them in the tabernacle so that they will dissolve. And the miracle happened when someone went back a few days later and looked at these samples in the water in the tabernacle, and they were bloody. They were oozing blood. They had turned red. And so they took them out of the water, stored them on a cloth, and then years later, even up until the year 2000, so these happened in 92, 94, 96, even up until the year 2000, I'm not quite sure why they waited so long to send them for analysis, but they did. There's a report of a chemist in the congregation, or a parishioner, who did look at the leukocyte formula. Basically, she was able to run a test on the samples right away and confirm that they are human blood, or at least her analysis was consistent with what human blood would be. But then the man who wrote this book, Ron Tesoriero in Australia, he's a journalist and a lawyer. He was asked by who is now Pope Francis, back when he was an archbishop, he was asked to document the investigation. So they sent these samples to New York, to other laboratories in Argentina. They sent them around to be analyzed, and they did, in science, this is something that is a hallmark of a good conclusion. When you do a number of different analyses independently, and they all point to the same conclusion. And these samples, just like the samples from, remember Lanciano, where
Yes.
12 centuries later they analyzed them, just like the samples from Tixla, Mexico in 2006, later on in 2006 were determined. All the Eucharistic miracles show human DNA, fresh samples, meaning the blood and the tissue still have white blood cells in them. Now, the experts will say that, and they just see this by looking at a microscope, there shouldn't be white blood cells. If the experts who didn't know what the samples were looked at it and said, this looks like tissue that just came from somebody who died from trauma a few hours ago. So it's living. It's living, and it has the white blood cells, which is indicative of trauma to the heart. And the samples were also found to be myocardium, and near, the experts say, near the part of the heart that pumps blood and gives life to the whole body.
So, and all the labs came up with the same conclusions. Progressively over time. So back in the 1300s, 1400s, they couldn't do tests like they can do now. But all the tests in the last 4 or 5 miracles since the 1990s, when they do the test in different places, different people, they get the same results. They also all have type AB blood. Which is characteristic of a person from the Middle East. So it's pretty interesting how they all do. That's why I wanted to see the lab reports. They all do. I mean, you could say, well, just because this sample tested consistent with the way it would look if it were human doesn't mean that it is human. Okay, you could say that, but when that happens over and over and over again, it's always consistent with human blood from the heart tissue that's undergone trauma, that's still living, which I think is the really neat part, and that it tests positive for human DNA. There's one more baffling part that I have seen the data for, and there's really not any better way to analyze it.
is that when they try to do a DNA analysis the old way, I'll get to that in a minute later on, but when they try to do the DNA analysis the old way, there's no human profile. And I looked that up. The DNA analysis done the old way looks at certain segments. So most of the DNA is the same, but it looks at certain segments that are unique to being human. But those segments are made up from mother and father DNA specifically. And it's really odd that those don't show up. So in those standard tests, they're not seeing the segments of DNA that are representative of a human having a mother and a father. And so some theologians have speculated, well, because Christ wouldn't have DNA from a human father. So that's sort of where it is now. And those are the tests I wanted to see, and they just simply are inconclusive.
I see. Okay. So now, just so that we know, like you hear about miracles all the time in various settings. Of course, there's always the joke one, like the Blessed Virgin Mary appearing in a piece of toast or something like that. And so there becomes a kind of source of derision for some people to point these things out. So what does the church actually say about these miracles? I mean, is it saying, yeah, okay, most things are not miracles, but these definitely are, or these could be, or what are we looking at as far as the church's kind of expression about these? Are we encouraged, for example, to think this is a miracle?
We're left to make our own decision, but the miracles in this book and the miracles we were specifically focusing on here were approved. And what it means for a Eucharistic miracle to be approved is that, something happens, you take it to the bishop or the archbishop, and that bishop initiates an investigation. And then the results of the investigation are presented to the bishop, and the bishop declares it authentic or not. So at that level, the bishops say that, yes, we've had a real investigation done. It's been done rigorously. It looks like it's a miracle, and so you're free to believe that it's a miracle. But it doesn't go so far as to impose it on people, as that you have to believe it.
All right, fair enough. A ton of callers. Shall we go to the phones?
Sure.
All right, Nate in Dallas, Texas, listening on Guadalupe Radio. Nate, your question for Dr. Stacy Trasancos.
Hi, thank you. Good afternoon. So I know that the Catholic Church is very, very meticulous and does its due diligence whenever a new miracle is brought forward, and they look into it, make sure that it's not fraudulent, and they also have offered the shroud several times for rigorous scientific examination, and DNA testing has been around for 30 years. I was wondering if they've compared the DNA of older samples as well as newer samples and against each other to see if they are the exact same DNA matches, and to tell us through anything about his traits, his physical features.
Okay. Dr. Trasancos.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I had a similar thought. But I had the thought so strongly, I thought, I wonder if I can write a proposal for a grant and get funding to conduct these studies, because they haven't been done, Nate, that I know of, and I think I've looked at everything. They have not been done. Now, the man in Australia, Ron Tesoriero, who sent the bishop these books for me to look at, he has asked that the mitochondrial DNA of these samples be compared for the same reason you're saying, because the mitochondrial DNA would have the DNA from the mother. There are people who have samples of Mary's hair, they say, and that would be something to compare it to. But no, I think those sequences should be done.
Yeah, we can get a little more on what mitochondrial DNA is when we come back. But Nate, thank you for the question. More on Eucharistic miracles with Dr. Stacy Trasancos right after this on Catholic Answers Live.
Catholic Answers Live.
Author Mark McNeil spent years in the Oneness Pentecostal movement, praying in its lively services, zealously spreading its unconventional teachings, and rejecting mainstream Christianity as misguided. Then he left it all behind. All in the Name is the story of a man who believed he was among an elite group of believers who followed the true faith when so many others had strayed. But an inquisitive mind, careful study, and the action of the Holy Spirit finally led Mark out of Oneness Pentecostalism and into the Catholic Church. This is an inspiring conversion story you won't want to miss. It's a faith strengthener for Catholics and an intriguing challenge to those who deny the doctrine of the Trinity. Order your copy of All in the Name today by calling 1-888-291-8000, logging on to the shop at Catholic.com, or asking for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Is the church wrong on contraception? In a culture that worships the pursuit of sexual pleasure, the Catholic Church's teaching on contraception can seem archaic and unintelligible. Its critics say it's outdated, theologically unfounded, and even harmful. And even faithful Catholics can have difficulty explaining this moral teaching. Catholic Answers is out to change all of that. That's why we've just released Trent Horn's dynamic new DVD, The Case Against Contraception. Using scripture, papal and magisterial teachings, natural law, and new insights provided by social science and medicine, Trent puts forward a compelling case for Catholic teachings with his trademark charity and persuasive graciousness. Be prepared to give a defense. Order your copy of The Case Against Contraception today by calling 1-888-291-8000, logging on to the shop at Catholic.com, or asking for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Have you hurt someone else's character?
We're discussing the sin of detraction on tomorrow's Take Two with Jerry and Debbie.
Now let's get back to Catholic Answers Live.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. Dr. Stacy Trasancos, theologian and chemist, is our guest this hour. She's also the executive director of the St. Philip Institute of Catechesis and Evangelization down in, what's the diocese name in Texas? What's your diocese?
Diocese of Tyler.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say it, and then I got scared that I was off. All right. So Nate was asking if they've ever compared the DNA from the various Eucharistic miracles. You're saying no, that's something that needs to be done, and you're possibly going to profit by getting a grant to do that. I thought that was interesting that you admitted you profit from it. But you were mentioning mitochondrial DNA, so you could conceivably, if you could extract mitochondrial DNA, you could compare to see if these had the same mother.
Yes, ideally you could match the DNA. So if you had, say, a strand of hair from the Blessed Virgin, and there are places that say they do have that, you could do the mitochondrial DNA of the hair and compare it to what you would find in these samples. And if it matched up, and if you could show that these tissues are actually living, like I was talking about before, then you could actually show that Christ was resurrected with science. And I'm real careful about saying that because I don't want anybody to think that we need science to prove that. But if you could look at the mother's DNA, and if it was the same in all these samples that are from fresh, miraculous tissues today, well, there you go.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting. Whether it'll ever be done or not, I don't know, because I'm not sure what all would have to be involved to actually do that.
Yeah. And there'd still be people who wouldn't believe it.
Yeah,
You'd still have a need for faith in order to believe. Let's go to Tracy in Fisherville, Kentucky, listening to EWTN Sirius XM Satellite Radio Channel 130. Tracy, your question for Stacy.
Hi, Stacy. How are you? Thanks for taking my call. It's kind of interesting because the question that I had, you almost answered all of it already in your description of the book and your inquisitive mind trying to figure things out. My husband and I actually were just in Italy. We did a holy tour, and we saw the Lanciano miracle, which is pretty unbelievable, but it is fascinating what they studied and how they studied it, because it was supposedly occurred between 730 and 750.
Yeah.
But they also have the wine that turned to blood and was coagulated in a vessel that you could see in this reliquary. Do you know, since you answered my other question, if the blood that was studied in that, with the species being, wine turned into blood, if they showed the similar type of trauma and blood type? I don't remember that when we went to see that when we were there.
No.
Okay.
Right. No, and what I found in these books I've read, they did not see that there was white blood cells in those samples. But they did do some sort of protein analysis that shows that the samples from Lanciano have the same, they give the same signal as fresh blood would. So they saw a similarity to fresh, but they did not see the white blood cells.
Tracy?
So that's different.
So that was even within the host as well that turned to flesh. They did not see the white blood cells.
I didn't see anything from Lanciano. Yeah, from the Lanciano reports, and there was one man, Dr. Linoli, I believe, who published his full analysis in an Italian scientific journal. I didn't see anything about the white blood cells being visible under the microscope in those samples. But in the other ones, in Tixla, in Buenos Aires, and in Poland in 2008, they did see the white blood cells.
I would venture to guess that part of the reason that is because it's almost 1,400 years old.
Yeah.
But
yeah, exactly.
The fact that it still shows how do you say that
mitochondrial.
Word? Mitochondria.
Yeah.
Yes.
Myocardium.
Part of the heart.
Oh, the myocardium. Yeah.
Yeah, for the heart.
Just in case anybody or people listening don't know, when we talk about the miracle of Lanciano, there was a priest in the 8th century in a church in Lanciano who was having personal doubts about whether the Eucharist really was the body and blood of Jesus. And following that kind of confession to himself that he was having these doubts, the Eucharist was transformed into actual heart muscle and blood, and it has remained. You would think over all those centuries, almost 13 centuries now, it would have degraded, but it has not. It's still there, and you can go to Lanciano, Italy, and see it. And maybe you should. Did I get it about right?
Yes, and I was surprised. There's over 100 Eucharistic miracles explained in this book, and many of them are exposed or visible during certain times still today. Yeah. They're still intact.
Tracy, thanks very much for that call. We go now to Tom in Ohio, also listening on Sirius XM Satellite Radio Channel 130. That's EWTN on Sirius Satellite Radio. Tom, your question for Dr. Stacy Trasancos.
Yes, Doctor, you're obviously a scientist, and you know that the universe works under the laws of quantum mechanics. Have you ever seen a tangible miracle? That means it defies the laws of physics. It defies the laws of quantum mechanics. It is random. For example, has anybody grown a new leg, or a new eye, or a new arm that you've seen or heard about?
No, I have never seen one. But like I started in the beginning, intellectually, I don't have a problem with accepting that miracles could happen. I've never seen one. I've never seen anybody grow a third leg, I saw my child grow a foot once, but that was over a year when she was getting older. But I've never seen anybody actually grow a third leg or another eye or something. And And I know what you're saying. Like, how can you just believe they occur then? That was one reason I was kind of afraid to even look at the scientific reports on these, because it made me a little nervous. Like, what if, like Cy was talking about the toast with the Virgin Mary's or Jesus in the toast. What if even the scientists are doing that just at a different level, where they're sort of biased in how they analyze the results? This is why I wanted to see the results for myself, so I could see what they were actually interpreting. But yeah, like I said before, if God holds everything in existence, why wouldn't he work miracles? Like, it would actually be illogical for him not to work miracles.
Do we still have you there, Tom?
Yes, and when you spoke about the living tissue, if you said that, or if it was said that there was no father, that would mean that there was no Y chromosome, and then the person would be a genotypic female.
Well, that's where you get into different ways to interpret the data. So if there's human DNA, but they can't get a typical human profile where they look at the contributions from a mother and father, that doesn't necessarily, it just says question mark. Like, what does this mean? We're not getting a typical human profile in the DNA the way they used to. Nate, the caller before, was talking about doing a DNA analysis. There are techniques now that can do a much more thorough DNA analysis of all the DNA, not just the segments that I was talking about before. And I think it would be interesting to see what those look like. But no, that wouldn't necessarily mean that that it's female.
Tom?
Balance the X.
Did I answer?
Was that answer satisfying, Tom, or no?
Well, that's the answer. Have to satisfy me. I thank you very much. That's been very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, Tom, I wanted to suggest something. I don't know if Tom is still there with us, but there's a little. She's not a little girl anymore, but there was a little girl named Benedicta McCarthy who was healed of hepatic necrosis. That's a dead liver, basically, at Massachusetts General Hospital. And her doctor, Ronald Kleinman, from Mass General Hospital, testified to the Vatican that I was willing to say it was miraculous. And I mentioned this one because when people are made saints, there are miracles that accompany those, and those can be investigated as well. And this was the miracle that was used to make Edith Stein, also known as Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, a saint in the Catholic Church. And the fact is, you have the doctor himself who was treating this girl willing to testify to the Vatican that this was miraculous, that a dying or dead liver was brought back to full health. And I often say to people, investigate these things. I don't even understand why in newspapers, for example, the New York Times will report an alleged miracle and not actually do an interview with the doctor and say, why did you testify to the Vatican that you saw a miracle? So I will just give you that name, Benedicta McCarthy. You can look that up. It's on the internet. She's still alive. You can ask her yourself if you want, whether or not that was a miraculous cure. Dr. Stacy Trasancos is our guest this hour. We're talking Eucharistic miracles, however, a very special kind of miracle, and I think it's fair to say, Stacy, that those miracles are given to us by God so that we will have faith in a very difficult proposition, which is that Christ is bodily present, body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist.
Yes, I tell you, it sure changed the way I think about things when I'm at Mass now. Like, I'm a convert, so for a long time I was very excited to be at Mass, because you're in the presence of Christ. There's a miracle going on in transubstantiation that Christ is present, and receiving the body and blood of Christ. It was so emotionally overwhelming for me for a long time. But then after the years, I sort of just got into the routine of doing the things, kneeling, and sometimes I'd look at the consecrated host and wonder, when exactly does it become the body? But it sparked a new appreciation in me. Like, it made it more real, where I think my own faith had started to just sort of go flat.
Right, because we're human. Without sensory input, It's very hard for us to maintain even something that we believe and hold precious. And God is good. He helps us in that way. Again, your calls are welcome. 888-31-TRUTH. Dr. Stacy Trasancos is our guest. And she's down there in Texas, but Texas is a big state, so we figured that we can send even more theologians and philosophers and apologists down there. So on March 29th and 30th, Tim Staples, Trent Horn, and Carlo Broussard will be part of the Fullness of Truth conference at Prince of Peace Catholic Church in San Antonio, Texas. Fullness of Truth conferences are offered in various places. So they'll also be on May 10th and 11th. Tim, Trent, and Carlo will be at Good Shepherd Catholic Church in Colleyville, Texas. You will leave these conferences on fire for your faith. It's hard not to hear those three guys and not. Just visit fullnessoftruth.org for more information.
Hello, this is Bishop Jeffrey Monforton, Bishop of the Diocese of Steubenville. Make sure you keep it on Catholic Answers Live. God bless you.
Do you love sharing the gospel and want to learn to be more effective? Join the St. Paul Street Evangelization Online School of Evangelization. You will learn to build bridges of trust and make disciples by befriending strangers, proclaiming the gospel, inviting people to the church, and praying with others. We'll ask for a pledge of financial support, but if you are unable to give, we'll give you a membership at no cost. Find out more and get involved today at streetevangelization.com. That's streetevangelization.com.
EWTN is now on Twitter. Get short, timely messages from EWTN on your computer or cell phone. It's easy to stay up to date on a wide variety of topics. Pro-life news, Vatican announcements, catechesis, apologetics, the latest EWTN programming, and more. You can link to EWTN on Twitter from our homepage or go to twitter.com/EWTN. At work, at home, at school, and on the road. Stay connected to your world with EWTN's Twitter page.
The Eucharist is just what the Catholic Church says it is. It's the body and blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. And sometimes the Lord reminds us of that by giving us Eucharistic miracles, and that is what we are talking about today. Eucharistic miracles with Dr. Stacy Trasancos, author most notably of Particles of Faith, which is now in a student edition. So look for that for your student, Particles of Faith, the student edition. A great guide for how to navigate science as a Catholic in the modern world. Lots of questions for Dr. Trasancos, so I'm going to just keep going through them. Jamie in St. Louis, Missouri, you are up next. Your question for Dr. Stacy Trasancos.
Okay, thanks for taking my call. I'll keep it brief. This is more of a comment, I guess, than a question. And I just want to say I so appreciate you coming on and talking about this Eucharistic miracle of Buenos Aires. And why? Because we've been using this the past 3 years. It was given to me as a gift by one of the parents, the video. And just like you, I'm laughing because I'm like, I don't want to know, the real story behind this. I want to believe it's true. And just like you were, I didn't want to delve into the deep depths of it, So I just so appreciate you coming in to Catholic Answers and talking about this very specific Eucharistic miracle, because it has meant everything to me. And I can't express the jaws that drop from these young 8th graders. I do confirmation. I do the confirmation program, and we show this video before our Eucharistic adoration event, and I can't express in words the look on this kid's eyes when they see this video and understand the truth behind what's been taught for over 2,000 years.
Well, let's let Dr. Trasancos, Jamie, let's just get her reaction to that so far.
Thank you so much. Thank you, because that gives us confidence to keep doing this. I totally agree. Part of what gave me, I guess, the courage to look into this stuff when I was a little bit afraid to, my teenagers, I have 7 kids, and like I said, 4 of them will be girls, or are girls, and will be teenagers next year. So they're asking a lot of questions, and I don't want them to struggle, but I know that they're gonna ask questions. They have free will. But my daughter was saying one day, I get that Jesus is there, and I get all the stuff that we've been talking about, and I know that he's really present in the Mass. And she's like, Mom, I have trouble, like drama with my friends, trouble trying to figure out what I'm going to do with my life, and all these heavy pressing issues for a teenager. She's like, I need Jesus to appear before me and sit right down, right here with me right now, and hold my hand and tell me what to do. Like, she just needed something like that. And I do think these miracles help young people or anybody, just like you said. They help make it more tangible, because we're human, we have limits, and we need something tangible to help us understand that it is real.
Jamie, I'm going to leave it there. I hope that was helpful to you, because I did say I want to get to as many callers as I can before we have to go. So we'll go now to Jenny in Minnesota, listening on Real Presence Radio. Jenny, your question for Dr. Stacy Trasancos.
I was wondering if there have been any Eucharist miracles that new advanced technology has disproved.
Yes, that's a great question. There is, I don't remember where it occurred, but it occurred, I think, in the United States, in the Midwest somewhere, maybe Ohio. I can't remember exactly, but you can Google it. There have been situations where a consecrated host fell on the floor, someone picked it up, put it in water, stored it in the tabernacle, all the procedures, and when they came back later, there was something red growing on it. Well, it turns out there is a form of a fungus, I think, or a bacteria, Serratia marcescens, I think is what it's called, but it looks red. It's like a bread mold, and it looks red, and it's a bright, deep red, like it looks like blood. And so there have been times when people thought that was a Eucharistic miracle, but that's a pretty easy one to analyze. Like when you look at it under the microscope, it looks like a fungus. It has a lot of tentacles. It looks very different from heart tissue. It's easily identifiable under a microscope, and then any kind of elemental analysis would also say this is not heart tissue. So there have been some cases where people thought that's what it was, and you'll find a lot in the skeptics who say these aren't miracles. Oh, that's just that bread mold growing, and they think it's blood. No, it's pretty easy to tell that it's not bread mold, because you just need to look at it under a microscope, and then you can do all these other analyses that are typically run on blood or heart tissue to verify that there's DNA and proteins and things like that there.
Jenny, what do you make of that?
I think that is really cool, and that will help me grow in my faith a lot.
Well, praise God for that, Jenny. It's a great question, because it would be really odd if it was like every time that someone claims a miracle, the church was going, yep, there's another one. It's really important for, I think, just for believability, that this be a rare thing that the church gives its approval. All right, Jenny?
That's awesome. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. On Facebook, Gwyneth asks the following, Dr. Trasancos. Do you have a concern of sacrilege in testing the species from a Eucharistic miracle?
That's a great question. I never really thought about that, but now that you ask, Gwyneth, I guess that's why there has to be, so it would be sacrilege if someone took it upon themselves, on him or herself individually, to do a test. But I'm pretty sure this is the correct answer, that the reason you go to the bishop and say, we found this, then it's sanctioned. There's, usually there's a committee that's formed, and there are people put in charge of the investigation. And so the investigation itself has been approved for certain purposes. That's a great question, because there's another part. I noticed that some of the more recent miracles, once the investigation is complete, then a full report is presented at a conference in that diocese to communicate the findings of the report in a very, in a very formal way. And I've noticed also sometimes there's time that passes between the discovery of the miracle and the completion of the investigation, like years, 3 years in one case. So I'm going to say that if you follow those procedures, you go to the bishop orders an investigation, and everything is in line with that investigation, then it's not sacrilege.
Thank you very much, Gwyneth, for that question. Several people mentioning on YouTube Eucharistic miracles in Poland. What do you know about that? Have there been? Are you familiar with Eucharistic miracles in Poland? And also, are they? What was the word you used? Approved Eucharistic miracles.
Yes. Yeah, the ones in Poland are, and they're in this book. There's quite a bit on those Eucharistic miracles. It happened in 2008, so it wasn't that long ago. And the bishop there had the investigation started, and they had 2 experts at, the University of Białystok. It's a university there in Poland. They had 2 medical doctors who were experts on the heart tissues, conduct investigations, and they found all the things that I was saying before. They found that the tissues were living. That's how they described it, that they are consistent with having experienced trauma. Even in these samples in Poland, a skeptic accused them of committing murder because the skeptic saw the samples and said, you got this from a person that was murdered just recently. But it wasn't. It came from, there was a trail of witnesses that verified it came from the Eucharist. But it was living tissue. It had the white blood cells indicative of trauma, had the same type AB. I made some notes here on that. And they even tested to rule out chemically that it wasn't that bread mold that I was talking about. But there was one more thing. They were accused in Poland of having swapped the samples. Okay, so somebody wants to say there's a Eucharistic miracle. Somebody swaps in a piece of tissue. That's why they accused him of murder. Somebody murdered somebody and swapped in a piece of heart tissue, and now they're calling it a miracle. They put it under an electron microscope, and what they saw, I can testify to this as a chemist who worked on building nanocomposites. Intertwined in the fibers of the heart tissue, the striated fibers, was also portions of the bread. And the scientists said it was as if the bread just became the heart tissue. And you cannot make that up. You can't affect that. You can't imitate that chemically, because you would have to get molecules to form bread and then intertwine with the heart, form bread. I mean, you just can't artificially simulate that in a laboratory. And so that was also a very compelling piece of information, and that's something you can see under a microscope that's strong enough.
Thank you, YouTube, for those questions. I don't have a name on that because there was various people asking that. But it strikes me that these, again, I just want to stress that these are needed miracles because there is this sense out there that I know you have fought for years that science is somehow superseding everything else, and we don't, that there isn't, I mean, come on, miracles, a kind of dismissal of every other part of life, and to be reminded that God hasn't given up just because, people fly in airplanes is very important.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, you can scientifically investigate miracles in the sense that you can, I mean, something in science needs to be repeatable, and we've seen this same kind of data repeated so many times now. It does. Science in this case, I have to say, I would have been hesitant to before, it does lend credence to these miracles. I don't know what any other explanation would be.
Dr. Trasancos, thanks for a great hour. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It was kind of fun to come at it from the miracle side instead of the science side with you.
Yeah.
For once. Science Was Born of Christianity. The Teaching of Father Stanley Yaki is one of Dr. Trasancos' books. The most famous one, though, I think I'm reasonable in saying, Particles of Faith, a Catholic Guide to Navigating Science. Now coming out in a student edition. Look for it. You can also find her at the St. Philip Institute for Catechesis and Evangelization. Coming up next, Doug Beaumont, former evangelical theology professor. We're going to talk about faith and works.
Aren't faith and reason two separate and distinct kinds of truth? Why do Christians believe in the biblical creation story when science has disproved it? How can the modern world take religion seriously when they oppose scientific advancements like birth control and stem cell research? In 20 Answers, Faith and Science, you'll find smart, solid answers to these questions and many more, clearing away misconceptions and helping you to understand and explain to your friends and family the complex but ultimately harmonious relationship between religious and scientific truth. 20 Answers, Faith and Science is part of the 20 Answers series from Catholic Answers, offering hard facts, powerful arguments, and clear explanations of the most important topics facing the Church and the world, all in a compact, easy-to-read package. Visit shop.catholic.com and take a look at this exciting new series from Catholic Answers Press.
With the recent commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the release of Humani Vitae, there have been fresh attacks on Catholic teaching from outside and, unfortunately, inside the Church. That's why Catholic Answers thought it critical to provide a vigorous affirmation of Pope Paul VI's prophetic wisdom with our newest book, Inseparable: 5 Perspectives on Sex, Life, and Love in Defense of Humani Vitae. We asked 5 distinguished contributors to reflect on and defend Humani Vitae from 5 perspectives, each of them compelling, together forming a mosaic of truth. Don't be caught uninformed when the topic comes up among friends, family, and co-workers. Order your copy of Inseparable today by calling 1-888-291-8000 or by visiting the shop at Catholic.com.
Have you subscribed to the Catholic Answers Radio Club newsletter? This is Catholic Answers Live host Cy Kellett, and I want to tell you about our new weekly newsletter full of behind-the-scenes information and facts you need to know about the show. It's easy to sign up. Just visit CatholicAnswersLive.com and look for the newsletter sign-up box on the front of the page. It's a great way to keep up to date with what's happening with the show and see what's coming in the days ahead, delivered weekly into your inbox. Sign up today for the Catholic Answers Radio Club newsletter and see what you've been missing. Go to CatholicAnswersLive.com.
Hey everyone, Carlo Broussard here. Are you looking for an on-fire Catholic speaker to come and speak at your conference or parish event? If so, you're in luck. We've got a host of Catholic Answers speakers, including myself, just waiting to get on a plane and come see you. Just go to CatholicAnswersSpeakers.com to get all the information you need to make your event the talk of the town. That's CatholicAnswersSpeakers.com. We look forward to seeing you.
So, you're listening to Catholic Radio. I think it's safe to say that you probably want to become like Jesus. Theosis is a fancy word used to explain the process of becoming like Christ. It's how God takes sinners like you and me and transforms us into who we were created to be. Basically, rockin' saints. Clumsy Theosis is a podcast where I take 2,000 years of Catholic goodness, draw from the great minds and spiritual masters of the Church, boil it down, distill it, and give practical advice to 21st century Christians. Basically, we'll learn how to do this Catholic thing like a boss. Subscribe to Clumsy Theosis wherever good podcasts are found.
Is the Church wrong on contraception? In a culture that worships the pursuit of sexual pleasure, the Catholic Church's teaching on contraception can seem archaic and unintelligible. Its critics say it's outdated, theologically unfounded, and even harmful. And even faithful Catholics can have difficulty explaining this moral teaching. Catholic Answers is out to change all of that. That's why we've just released Trent Horn's dynamic new DVD, The Case Against Contraception. Using scripture, papal and magisterial teachings, natural law, and new insights provided by social science and medicine, Trent puts forward a compelling case for Catholic teachings with his trademark charity and persuasive graciousness. Be prepared to give a defense. Order your copy of The Case Against Contraception today by calling 1-888-291-8000, logging on to the shop at Catholic.com, or asking for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I'm Cy Killett, your host. Delighted to be with you on a very happy day here at Catholic Answers. And just in case you missed the last hour, the reason it's happy is producer Darren and his wife Rena just welcomed their third child on Saturday. Little baby Zoe is in the world and looking good. They did that thing where they take a picture of the baby just born. My goodness, that's a good-looking baby. That's a baby that's like, I'm ready. I am ready for this world. I am fairly certain that my baby picture did not look like that. I do not think I was ready. This hour, we welcome, before I tell you, we welcome Doug Beaumont. I want to let you know we're going to be discussing faith and works. And so the question is always now for Catholics, why do you believe in a gospel of works? We face that from our post-Reformation brothers and sisters in the faith. There's the general belief that we teach a gospel that says you got to earn your way to heaven or that kind of thing. Or in some cases, I imagine, it's not believed that that's what we believe, but the claim is made in order to keep the, I suppose, the checks coming in and that kind of thing. That's only probably a few preachers here and there. Most people sincerely hold the view that by faith alone we are saved, or who express that view, I'm sure, sincerely hold it. If you hold that view, you're welcome to call 888-318-7884. If you'd like to know what the Catholic Church really teaches about the relationship between faith and works, this is the hour for you. 888-318-7884. As I said, our guest is Douglas Beaumont. Doug is a former evangelical Christian and the author of Evangelical Exodus, Evangelical Seminarians and Their Paths to Rome. He has a PhD in theology from Northwest University and an MA in apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary, where he served as assistant to President Norm Geisler and taught Bible and religion for 10 years. Doug Beaumont, thanks very much for being with us.
Great to be here, Cy. Thank you.
I don't know, I was a little scattered there in my introduction, but you get the general picture. The Catholics are the works people and the Protestants are the faith people.
Sure.
Right? So what's wrong with that story?
Well, I think there's numerous difficulties with it. I think number one, what people need to understand is that there's different kinds of works in Scripture. There's good works, there's works of darkness, there's works of the law, and I think that probably the easiest way to summarize the particular problem that I had as an evangelical was that we confused legalism, which is trusting in the Old Testament works of the law for salvation, with just any kinds of works whatsoever.
Oh, I see.
And so we would apply verses that were only talking about the contrast between the Old and the New Covenant salvation methods with just works in general. And so by flattening it out like that, anybody that says that any works are involved in salvation instantly sound like a legalist when really they're not.
Again, 888-318-7884 is the number, 888-318-7884. So does some of this argument over faith and works come down to a disagreement about our own participation in salvation? That is, a difference of opinion on whether or not we are invited to participate in our own salvation or whether we are completely helpless and reliant on God to do all of it for us?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. Your more reformed side of the Christian spectrum tends to want to elevate the sovereignty of God in any way they can, and specifically by reducing human freedom. The thought being that it's kind of a zero gain game here, where whatever glory God gets, it has to be taken away from the human, and vice versa. And so when it comes to salvation, we don't want to give any glory to mankind's free will, because then it would reduce God's sovereignty and his glory. Whereas, a different way to look at it is that God receives glory by the fact that his free creatures are cooperating with his grace. So, once you kind of start off on one of those paths, it tends to really limit what kinds of interpretations you're going to allow in your theology.
Well, if I may, reading the Gospels recently in church, we have this Jesus making clear that look, like the sheep and the goats, and some of you did these things for me and some of you didn't. So just in fairness, not trying to be a gotcha or anything like that, how does an evangelical who says works don't matter, only faith does, reconcile that with Jesus saying that your works can condemn you or save you?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I once heard John MacArthur say that Christ made no formal explication of the doctrine of justification, which I found interesting because Jesus actually uses that word in several places. But it's in uncomfortable verses if you are coming from a more Reformed perspective. He says, by your words you will be justified. This man who was not a Pharisee, by throwing himself on God, he went home justified. We are justified in the eyes of others. He actually had quite a bit to say about it. And I know that for me, at least, when I was an evangelical, we had this idea of kind of two tiers of scripture where you had your clear verses and your unclear verses. And so the clear verses would be like Ephesians 2:8 and 9, where, we are saved by grace through faith and that not of ourselves, not by works. There you go. That's a clear verse. So then when you come to all of the verses that talk about works being a part of salvation, you always interpret those in light of the clear verse.
I see.
And so, and again, there's numerous options as a Protestant. There's so many, there's the Reform view, there's the more Arminian view, there's the free grace view, there's the on and on it goes with how you deal with both sides of the equation, because it's there. I mean, there's no getting around it. Scripture, we all have our proof texts, right, for our own view. So I don't really think anybody clearly has a biblical advantage necessarily one side or the other. It's just that what happens is we get our theology straight, we see the verses that clearly seem to teach that theology, we camp on those, and then everything else kind of becomes out on the periphery, and they get interpreted according to our theological interpretation of the other verses. Which would work if Scripture, nicely color-coded all of the clear verses, so that we know which ones are clear and unclear. But depending on where you start and what theology you already have in your mind, that's really what's going to differentiate the two.
Okay, fair enough. That's a fair answer. 888-318-7884, and it's not a. One assumes that there are people can give reasons for their beliefs, but as a Catholic, these passages always strike me as strikingly clear that you got to do stuff. Like the young man who says to Jesus, what must I do to have everlasting life? And Jesus tells him, keep the commandments. I mean, and he lists the commandments. They're all doing things,
right.
Or not doing things. So now that's not where the conversation ends, of course, but that's where Jesus starts, is by keeping the commandments. So fair enough. 888-318-7884 is our number. However you may fall down, whichever side you might come down on in this discussion, you are welcome to call 888-318-7884. The lines we're very busy on the lines. Would you like to take some calls, Doug?
Sure. Yeah, those all look good.
Doug Beaumont is our guest. The question is faith and works. How do we think as Catholics about faith and works? Rob in Grand Rapids, Michigan, listening on Holy Family Radio. You are up first. Your question, Rob.
Well, thanks for taking my call. Bear with me, I'm not Catholic, but I heard a interview the other day. Doesn't mean this is the whole Catholic stance, I know, but guy who started the L'Arche, I think, community around the world.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, the secular interviewer asked him a question about faith and works, and he said that someone in his community was sick and almost dying, and he said, when you die, you'll have peace and happiness and all this. And she said, but I don't believe. And he said, but you've been a kind person and done good work, so you'll be okay. And I didn't seem like that would fit Catholic theology, but I wondered your thoughts.
All right.
Yeah, Rob, I appreciate your question and not just running with that too much. And I think your insight, your intuition is correct. This is not really a good reflection of the Catholic view. Now, I didn't hear the interview. I don't know where that statement came, what kind of context it was in. The Catholic Church's teaching on salvation is a lot more detailed and fine-grained, I think, than a lot of Protestant views, because it's trying to take all of the biblical and traditional data and put it together. There is a sense in which a person who, through no fault of their own, is not a believer, who probably doesn't even know that they're not a believer, in a sense, may be judged on their works. And it's possible, we don't know for sure if it will happen or not, but it's at least theologically possible that God could have mercy on a person like that through Christ's death and resurrection, and that gets applied to this person who, again, through no fault of their own, is not a believer. But that would be a very much an edge case. That's not something that we would want to build our theology on top of. It's really just a way of acknowledging that, look, God is not just checking a box to see if you get into heaven or not. He's a merciful, he's a loving God, and we have to willfully disbelieve, really, in order to remove ourselves from that mercy. So if this person who was sick and dying knew full well the gospel, understood it, and was saying, I do not believe that, no, I don't think we have any reason to believe they'll be in heaven because of their good works. That would be a distortion of the Catholic teaching.
Rob, I wanted you to respond, if you like. How does that strike you?
Well, it's kind of what I was hoping he would say, because I didn't want to think that that's what Catholics believe.
Well, the L'Arche communities, I imagine it was probably Jean Vanier who was being interviewed as a saintly man, but not uncontroversial in some of his theology, and which is the case sometimes. Sometimes the most saintly people out there really living the gospel are not necessarily the ones to explain it. But and I'm not trying to criticize Jean Vanier. I didn't hear the interview either. So, Rob, thanks for the opportunity to address that. 888-318-7884, 888-318-7884, and also things that are said to the dying are sometimes abbreviated given the dying process. So
that's not the time to bust out the Summa Theologiae and start
right.
It seems that
right. You might just say what it comes to your mind as helpful at the time. What I don't know if that was Jean Vanier, who is the founder of L'Arche. That I'm not sure what was in his mind, but we'll leave that there. And thank you very much for the call. We're talking about faith and works with Douglas Beaumont today. You can find out all about him at douglasbeaumont.com. Among his many books, Evangelical Exodus is one, but you can find out about all of them there, douglasbeaumont.com.
We're glad you're with us. Stick around for more Catholic Answers Live.
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
Don't you feel sometimes like there's so many people in the world? How does he hear your prayer? Never think of that, huh? Everybody thinks of that. I'm only a little grain of sand on the seashore. Oh, but that's not true. See, God is God. And you and I have to let God be God. I don't know how he does it. He's God.
For more information on Mother Angelica, visit Religious Catalog at EWTNRC.com.
Catholic Answers Live is brought to you in part by CatholicSingles.com, the website for Catholics who want to meet others who share their faith and values for faith, fellowship, and love. You can learn more at CatholicSingles.com. Catholic Answers Live thanks CatholicSingles.com for their generous support.
Homeschool Connections, an online provider of courses for your Catholic homeschool, is a sponsor of Catholic Answers Live. Homeschool Connections website is homeschoolconnections.com.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. I am Cy Kellett, your host. Douglas Beaumont is our guest, and we are talking about faith and works. Doug's, how should I say this? Worked both sides of that fence as an evangelical and as a Catholic. And whatever side of that fence you are, I don't know if I should be describing this. It sounds so separating to call it a fence. Maybe it's I got nothing else. Okay, so it is a separating point between us.
It's almost like they're separated brethren, to totally coin a phrase out of nowhere.
Oh, what an excellent point, Doug. At 888-31-TRUTH is the number, 888-318-7884. Let's go to Daniel in Winchester, Virginia, listening on 89.7 from Christendom College there, the great Christendom College. Daniel, your question for Doug Beaumont.
Hi there. Thanks for having me on the show. Mr. Beaumont, I just want to thank you for your work. I went to an evangelical college and studied the Bible and studied theology, and there were several graduates from Southern Evangelical Seminary, and so your work and your witness has been influential in my journey to the Catholic faith in the last number of years. So thank you, and God bless you for that.
Oh, excellent. That's really good to hear. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask, I'm thinking of the best way to put this, but as a convert from Protestantism, what would you say is the best that Protestantism could offer on the subject of faith and works, or the most sound interpretation from a Protestant perspective of the relationship between faith and works? And then how would you recommend one charitably respond to that perspective as a Catholic?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Thank you. So I would say the strongest argument is going to come from some proof text, just individual verses in Scripture that aren't necessarily being taken out of context or anything like that, that seem to pit faith and works against each other. So the most famous go-to verse is going to be Ephesians 2:8-9. I'm going to just read it so that we're all, I'll even read it in the ESV so that all of my Reformed brothers are happy. St. Paul says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works." Okay, so if that is your go-to verse, it's pretty clear St. Paul is contrasting salvation through faith and works, and you just sort of go on from there. If that verse is accurate, well, then any adding works to faith, you're taking something that is a gift of God and you're trying to earn it through wages. Paul talks about this in Romans, totally destroys that idea. If it's a gift, it's not a work, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the best response to that is to recognize a few things. Number one, Ephesians 2:8-9 does not say that salvation is by faith. I used to catch my students in this all the time. The verse actually says it is by grace that you're saved. Faith is an instrument here. It's an instrumental cause in a sense. It is through faith that God's grace saves us. And then if you read the rest of the passage, it says, we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand, that we should walk in them. So first of all, expand the passage a little bit so that you see that faith and works are not actually being contrasted here as not being part of salvation, but rather they just have different roles. And as you go through the rest of St. Paul, and I just put something up on the my website on this recently, what you come to see is that when Paul is talking against works, when he's actually negative, when he's denying works value in salvation, he qualifies the word works in different ways. They're works of darkness, works of sin, works of the law. And like I said earlier, in those cases, what he's actually doing is he's pitting the old covenant versus the new covenant. He's not pitting works against faith. It's a specific kind of work, that is trusting in the Old Testament, the old covenant law to save people. When you get out of Romans and Galatians, where he's talking about those kinds of works, and you get into the pastoral epistles and other places, now suddenly Paul has a very positive outlook on works and their value to salvation, but he's no longer talking about works of the law. So when we take Paul's writings in total, we see that Ephesians 2:8-9 works perfectly well with Catholic theology. It seems in this case to work perfectly well with Protestant theology as well. But when you list the 30 or so places where Paul is discussing the role of works in salvation, it's actually very even-handed, which I think is really much more like the Catholic view.
What do you make of that, Daniel?
That's very helpful. Thank you very much.
All right, very, very good. Thank you. You got that grace and faith thing, man. You totally. I was like, what? How? I never even noticed that.
It's easy to miss when you're kind of running for the faith part.
Yeah.
The very first verse is, by grace. Interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what all Christians teach. You know, there's no legitimate, whatever you want to call it, Christian tradition that teaches that we can work our way to heaven. Everybody has to deal with this balance between faith and works. And that one verse, I think, is a great beginning place because it lists all the different causes in one place.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Let's go to Caesar in Houston, Texas, listening on Guadalupe Radio. Caesar, your question for Doug Beaumont.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I wanted to ask what the difference in view is in grace, salvation, justification in the Catholic and the Protestant view. What's the differences? Because oftentimes as a Catholic, as a cradle Catholic, I've never known to separate works from faith, So, like, I always look at it as, like, this ongoing thing, when we were baptized, that's a work. When we believe, that's a work. Whenever we, when we do anything, it's a work. And we're not adding to Christ's, to his death and resurrection, but we're just, like, cooperating with it. We're kind of like, the way that I see it, if you believe in Christ, then you live your life accordingly. It's not just like a simple verbiage, like, oh, I believe, and then go out and sin. No, I mean, it's like you believe, and you do works. I mean, I don't know. I just never separated it. So, when I talk to people before, I've always run into this little thing like, oh, well, it's because Catholics view justification different. Like, how exactly are we looking at justification different? Is my question.
Great. Okay, Caesar. Yeah, there's a lot there, and thank you for explaining your question. Where to even start? So, one thing to note is that justification is a word that is used in Scripture. However, it is used in a wider sense than Protestants typically use it. And this happens with a lot of words. This is not a criticism. We try to be biblical in our language, but then at the same time, the Bible often uses words in different ways. So sometimes Paul presents justification as something that happened in the past and it's already done. That's the way Protestants typically look at it. But other times, it's more of a present tense thing, like an ongoing type thing, which is how Catholics also see it. So in the Catholic world, we tend to equate salvation and justification in all of its phases. So there's a beginning point of salvation, there's the part that we're living right now, and then there's a future part that happens in heaven. And Protestants typically recognize that division in salvation as well, but they rename the stages, which is maybe a little more precise. But they'll typically refer to kind of the point at the beginning of the line as justification. And then the line itself, the process that we're in right now, they'll call sanctification, and then the final what we would call justification in heaven is known as glorification. And those words are fine. They get used in different ways in Scripture as well. But the difficulty is that if you are a Protestant and you believe that justification is just this initial point of salvation, then that comes by faith before you can do any works. I mean, it would be ridiculous to try to put works in there because it's not even like it's stretched out in time. It's a point. Add on to that many Protestants, not all, but many, believe that justification cannot be lost. There's nothing you can do to lose it. There's nothing you can do to get it. So because it's all by God's grace and his sovereignty, and we're not part of that, and our works aren't part of it, that justification happens once for all. And so when they hear the Catholic talk about justification and how you've got to continue in faith and love and hope and works, well, then that just doesn't even fit their categories many times. And so, and that's not the end of it. They also see justification in a more legal sense, where God is declaring people to be just, even though they're not. And so it's sometimes called a legal fiction type thing. Whereas when Catholics say someone is justified, they mean that there's actually a change of the person. There's actually a difference between your soul now and when it wasn't justified. And because Protestants tend to see that more as a label than as an actual change, the works and everything coming in don't make sense either.
Caesar.
Yes.
Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does make a lot of sense. I just kind of wanted to, so in a sense, I guess, we believe the same, but it's just worded different. It's like a semantics type of thing.
No, it is more than that. So I would say the first part of my answer is that's part of it, is there is this verbal issue where we're using different words for different things. And because the Catholic tends to just say salvation and justification as the same thing, point, middle, and end, and Protestants tend to limit it to the point, there's that problem. But there's also the problem that what justification actually is for the Catholic is totally different than what it is for the Protestant. For the Catholic, being justified means God calls you just, but he also makes you just. And that second part is not part of Protestant theology. Justification is a legal declaration. It's kind of a label that you get, rather than an actual change that has to occur. And so that's why in the Catholic faith, deadly sins that John talks about can actually lose the state of justification. You're no longer in a state of grace. You're actually a different state now in reality. It's not just that your label has changed. And so we have the problem of different semantics, and we also have the problem of the actual theological change that takes place, and both of those are different.
Caesar, thank you very, very much for the question. We're talking faith and works today. It's pretty hard to get more basic than that in conversations between Catholics and Protestants and Orthodox people and everyone else claiming to be Christian in the world. And so we're delighted to have Doug Beaumont here to talk about it with us, a former evangelical himself, the author of Evangelical Exodus, and a theologian and apologist. You can find out all about him at douglasbeaumont.com, or you can just call and ask your question, 888-318-7884.
Join us on air today on Catholic Answers Live.
A generation ago, Christian parents didn't have to worry about how to explain transgenderism to their 9-year-old or help their teenager deal with mockery at school for believing in traditional marriage. But today, as our culture's moral center continues to fly apart, and with every form of deviance publicly aired and celebrated, we have no choice but to equip our kids to understand about such issues. In Made This Way, How to Prepare Kids to Face Today's Tough Moral Issues, Layla Miller and Trent Horn give parents the crucial tools and techniques to form children with the understanding they need, appropriate to their age and maturity level, to meet the world's challenges. Silence can no longer be an option. If we're not teaching our children how to understand tough moral issues, then the world will. Read Made This Way and learn how to give your kids a firm foundation on which to build a life of moral clarity and happiness. Order your copy of Made This Way today by calling 1-888-291-8000 or logging on to the shop at Catholic.com.
Al Crestus says, "The greatest doctrinal obstacle to my return to the Catholic Church was fear that Catholics had no basis for or boundaries on the Marian dogmas. If only Tim Staples had written Behold Your Mother then. I can't think of a more insightful, comprehensive, single volume that persuades so thoroughly. Great, truly great piece of apologetics." Order your copy of Behold Your Mother today by calling 1-888-291-8000, visiting the online shop at Catholic.com, or asking for it at a good Catholic bookstore near you.
Have you hurt someone else's character?
We're discussing the sin of detraction on tomorrow's Take Two with Jerry and Debbie.
Now let's get back to Catholic Answers Live.
Talking faith and works today with Doug Beaumont, our guest, and your calls are welcome. 888-318-7884, 888-318-7884. Let's go to Steve in Tulsa, Oklahoma, listening on 94.9 FM St. Michael's Radio. Steve, your question for Doug.
How are you guys doing?
Very well, thank you.
Doing well, Steve.
Great. Good. So the biggest thing that I run across, being a Catholic down in Tulsa, which not a big Catholic population, is that whenever I hear that there's no works involved whatsoever, when I'm talking to my Protestant brothers and sisters, is that they ask if you've accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior. And in my mind, that is something that you have to do. So when I bring that up to them, they have a hard time answering that, because if there's no works involved whatsoever, then how do we know who is saved and who is not saved? So that seems to be somewhat of a stumbling block when I'm talking to my friends.
Yeah, I think.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that comes up, even inner debates. For one thing, you always got to remember that when you're asking a question about Protestants, there's likely multiple answers, and this debate is something that is live within Protestantism today. You've got a big spectrum that tends to focus very heavily on one side or the other. On the extreme, I guess you'd call it left, I don't know. You have something like the free grace view, which says that essentially God saves you, and there literally is nothing you can do, including unbelief, that can make you lose your salvation. So they might even reject something like the sinner's prayer. But the way it was typically thought of in my point of view was that receiving a gift is different than working for a wage. And that's really the contrast that is set up in Scripture, is that, and Paul uses those exact words in Romans, that when you work for something, you get it as a wage. It's something you're due. It's something that justice obligates someone to do for you. The reception of a gift, it might require you to receive the gift for you to get it, but you didn't do anything to earn it. And it's really that idea of earning that is problematic for the Protestant. They think that if you have to do a thing to get salvation, well, then you're earning it like a wage, which is clearly against what Paul is talking about. So doing something like saying the sinner's prayer, or even just changing your mind mentally and not even moving your lips, theoretically could be a work, but it's really not a work in the way that any I would say knowledgeable Protestant would consider it to be, because you're not earning anything. And as long as you're not earning a wage, there isn't a problem. Steve?
That's where the going against sacraments. So being baptized is a work that you have to do, that they would say you do not have to do any kind of a work like baptism. You just have to believe.
That's right. Yeah, and they'll point to passages in Scripture where baptism itself is called a work of righteousness, and then it says we are not saved by works of righteousness. So guess what? You're not saved by baptism. Again, everybody has their proof text. At the end of the day, our theological interpretation is going to come into play. I mean, there's really no way to avoid that. And I think that one of the strengths of the Catholic viewpoint is that we kind of admit that. We don't pretend that an open Bible is just going to transmit its truth right into our brains with no interpretation, no theology in between. But then again, we have our proof text too, right? We have James 2:24, which says justification is not by faith alone. I mean, that's an exact verbal contradiction with the very founding idea of the Reformation. So if you can theologize your way out of a direct contradiction, well, then you kind of have to let other people have their theology too. I just think that the Catholic is, in a sense, more honest about our need for theology and interpretation, and then has an authoritative structure to help with that. Whereas the Protestant is sort of trapped in their proof texts, and when something comes along that doesn't work, like you are saved by baptism now saves, okay, yeah. is right in Acts. Those become a lot more difficult to deal with.
Steve, thank you very, very much. We're talking faith and works with Doug Beaumont today. We go now to Alyssa in Chattanooga, Tennessee, listening on the Catholic Answers Live app. Alyssa, thanks for downloading the app onto your phone. Your question for Doug.
Yeah, absolutely. Big thanks to you guys, by the way, for everything that you do. So I was having a conversation with one of my Pentecostal friends today about the topic of salvation and what differentiates us. And she brought up the penitent thief, now St. Dismas, and I was wondering how that is to be interpreted if the Catholic Church teaches that faith without works is dead. But up until the last few seconds of his life, he did not believe in God or did not lead that kind of life.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've actually got a little thing on my website about this. But first of all, you noted that he's considered by the Church to be Saint Dismas, so it's pretty clear Catholics believe that he went to heaven. A couple things about this. Number one, we need to remember that this is a very unusual case. It's not typical that someone's body is nailed to wood when they become and they're about to die when they come to faith. And again, what I always try to tell people is, look, there are guidelines that God gives us, but he's not ridiculous. God is not up there with the check boxes. Oh, sorry you were nailed to a cross and couldn't get baptized. You're going to hell forever. That is just not what a loving, merciful God would do on any view. So what we don't want to do, though, is take something so unusual and say, well, that now is the paradigm for all time. If you want to do that, what you really need to do is say, okay, well, anybody who is about to die and is nailed to a cross and can't do anything can get saved without works. Okay, great. But, nobody wants that as part of their soteriology. So rather, I think that what the church does, and this is with the martyrs and a lot of other people, is to simply say that, look, there are guidelines for people who are willing to do certain things, that they should do those things, and if they're unwilling, that's a problem. But somebody who's willing something, who by no fault of their own cannot achieve those things, God doesn't judge them for that as if they were unwilling. He judges them as if they were willing and they were withheld from doing what they willed. So the thief on the cross is not a counterexample to baptismal regeneration. He's not a counterexample to a life of piety and good works. He is a perfect example of someone who literally physically can do nothing except talk. And what does he do? He indicates his faith. He does everything he can do from the cross to indicate his faith, and all the works that could possibly be done from the cross, he does them. So there's no reason that there should be any problem thinking that he is in heaven from a Catholic or a Protestant point of view.
Alyssa?
Thank you so much. I think that helps it's hard to discuss these type of things and not get caught up in the two-dimensional type of thinking that I think happens a lot. But yeah, I appreciate that a lot.
Well, thank you very much, Alyssa. 888-31-TRUTH is the number. We're talking faith and works with Doug Beaumont. We go now to Patrick in Lansing, Michigan, listening on 90.9 FM. Patrick, your question for Doug.
Well, hello, and thank you for having me on. I wanted to respond to Mr. Beaumont's little piece he did on justification and works and faith and so on. And I'm a former Catholic, became a born-again Christian in the mid-30s of my life, and became a Protestant and became very interested in the historic differences between the Reformers and the Catholic Church, particularly laid out at the Council of Trent in 1647. And in the Council of Trent, in the canons and decrees, they very carefully laid out their position on justification, and the Reformers responded with various creeds and confessions in their understanding of justification. So if I could summarize briefly, the historic Protestant position is, as Mr. Beaumont said, that justification is forensic. That is, it's a legal declaration by God stating that the sinner is just legally, but in fact he is not just internally. He is obtaining that justification or that declaration through faith in what Christ has done, namely Christ's death on the cross to pay the penalty for sin. Jesus has absorbed that punishment for us. So that word, the Protestants would go to Romans 4, where it is stated 11 times in that passage that Christ's righteousness is imputed. So that word imputed became the Protestant byword.
Yeah, that's the Protestant standard. Patrick, I got to get you to move towards a question, however. I appreciate the summing up of the general view of Protestants, but you wanted to challenge Doug how?
I wanted to say that it's more than what Doug, he did state some things, but there were some more things. So namely, the big difference between Protestants and Catholics was The double imputation of Christ's righteousness imputed to me and my sin imputed to Christ as a believer, that is done by faith and by faith alone, but it is not by a faith that is alone.
Okay. All right. So can you respond to that, this double imputation, Doug?
Yeah. Well, if I can start off with a bit of an illustration, I tend to think of theology as at least the Catholic view, of course, because I hold this, that, if the truth is kind of at the top of a pyramid, if you move away from it, two things happen. Number one, you move farther away from the truth, but you also move farther away from a lot of different views. And I think that this is what happens a lot of times, where the Catholic Church, I believe, has a very balanced view of not just this chapter of Romans or that chapter of whatever, but the whole of Scripture. And so to disagree with it requires you moving away from the truth into more extreme views. And so I think that many times what happens is Protestants affirm something that the Catholic Church really doesn't have that much of a problem with, but it's what they exclude. In other words, in a lot of ways, you can be right about what you affirm, but then wrong about what you deny. And the idea of imputation is that Christ sort of gives us his righteousness, but not in any way that actually affects us. It's just sort of there. God can't see through it. And then we give him his sin. And of course, Paul talks about this sort of thing, that we get original sin from Adam, and then we get salvation from Jesus. The church affirms all of that. What it does not affirm is that nothing changes because of that. And so we're really marrying two concepts instead of trying to break them apart and then pick one or the other, which is what you see with most Protestant theology, is that they break apart things that are not meant to be broken apart, and then they have to pick one or the other because now they're opposed to each other. So, we have Romans 4 in our Bible too. We didn't have to call it an epistle of straw and get rid of it. We didn't have to add words to it like Luther did to Romans 3 to derive our theology. But we do explain those words in a different way. A lot of words were used in that explanation that are not part of Scripture. It never says anything about justification being legal. There's nothing in that word that necessarily brings out Protestantism. Again, it's another theological way of explaining the text. There are adherents, there are reasons to think it's good, reasons to think it's bad, but the Catholic Church isn't really on the horns of that dilemma. We can affirm both sides.
So it's perfectly fine to say, yes, Christ's righteousness is imputed to us, or his justification is imputed to us, but you would just say that, well, be careful what you mean by the word imputed.
Right. Yeah. And, usually what you hear, kind of your more Lutheran, Calvinistic type theology is that, Christ's righteousness kind of covers us like a sheet, so that when God looks at us, he doesn't see what's really there. He just sees the sheet. And, again, there are a few verses that if that is what you are thinking going in, it sounds very much like that's the case. But then there's a whole bunch of verses that don't sound anything like that. And somehow they all have to be true. And I think that Catholic theology has figured out that balance. What Luther did, we talked about, Trent and history. The Anglican scholar Alistair McGrath proved in a huge work on justification that what Luther came up with was what he called a theological novum. This was a brand new thing that the church had never even seen before. And then Luther went on to say that if sola fide goes, so does the church and so does the gospel. So, if you just sort of do the math, it looks like the church didn't exist for 1,500 years until Luther came along with this brand new way of explaining Romans. The church didn't have any trouble explaining Romans prior to Luther, and it still doesn't.
Indeed. I believe I've heard it read at Mass many times. 888-318-7884 is the number. Patrick, thanks very much. Right now, the store-wide spring sale is on at shop.catholic.com. Lots of great resources there, but you get 15% off store-wide if you put in the promo code SPRING19 at shop.catholic.com.
Stay with us for more Catholic Answers Live.
Are you a coffee drinker? If so, you can now enjoy a coffee roasted to perfection by the Carmelite monks of Wyoming. Delicious Mystic Monk coffee is roasted and prepared by monks in a hidden cloistered monastery and is available in over 25 varieties. All Mystic Monk coffees are works of perfection and labors of love. For more information on how to purchase Mystic Monk coffee, visit mysticmonkcoffee.com. That's mysticmonkcoffee.com.
Catholic radio gives us an opportunity to become part of a larger family. It can be so lonely when we are struggling in our faith or just try to live our faith on our own. But Catholic radio connects us to that larger community of faith where we're able to get the support, the encouragement, and the grace that we need to not just struggle on, but to really celebrate all the blessings that God brings into our life through our Catholic faith.
Dr. Greg Popchak thinks Catholic radio is important. So should you.
Pope Francis reminds us that it does not take a specialized degree in theology to become a great evangelist. We're all called to evangelize. Think about the woman at the well. After she encountered Jesus, she immediately went into the city and invited others to meet him as she had. You and I can go out now and do the same. And St. Paul Street Evangelization can help. Get involved today by contacting us at streetevangelization.com. That's streetevangelization.com.
Welcome back to Catholic Answers Live. We're talking about faith and works today with Doug Beaumont. Doug is the author of Evangelical Exodus, Evangelical Seminarians and Their Paths to Rome. And I just want to, and a former evangelical himself, but this is an interesting book because there does seem to be happening in Protestant evangelical circles a discovery of the Catholic Church among some people. And so this is what you wrote about, was that people finding out, wait a second, these Catholics are not nuts, and they're not, this is not the Whore of Babylon. And maybe there's something to this sacramental theology and all that.
Yeah, there's the book was written primarily to answer just some kind of legends that had gone around about why people from this particular seminary were becoming Catholic. I mean, James White had been going after SES for long before I came along. So the book I thought was important just to show how our particular seminary seemed to be producing so many Catholics. But it happens everywhere. There's guys from Westminster and other places like that. The Call to Communion website is just full of these guys with very heavy-duty Reform backgrounds that have become Catholic. Of course, the losses go both ways. But it does seem to me that the majority of Protestants I know that used to be Catholic don't know the Catholic faith nearly as well as Catholics who used to be Protestant know Protestantism. It seems that the general rule is that your better Protestants are the ones that become Catholic, and your worse Catholics are the ones that become Protestant. And I heard that at an Evangelical Theological Society meeting from a Protestant, so don't judge.
I just don't know how I'm not Protestant then. If it was the bad Catholics that have been going over, I don't know how.
Yeah, well, just don't talk to any evangelicals. You'll be all right.
I'm kind of stuck now because the experience makes you stuck. I suppose this is true in a way that the experience of the sacraments has a settling effect in that I don't want to leave the sacraments. I don't ever want to leave the sacraments.
Yeah, and I think it's a lot harder to even know where would you go.
Right.
If somebody convinces me to not be Catholic, I kind of feel like Peter in John 6. To whom will I go? This is hard, and I don't even like this part. But am I going to be charismatic? Am I going to be Reformed? Am I going to be Methodist? That whole world is just such a circus. It really takes, I think, kind of an ignorance of what Protestantism really is like. To leave the Catholic faith for just this, Creekside evangelical community church on the corner, across the street from the other one. that you're really jumping into something that is just a complete mess. Not that
we're not
messy, not that we're not messy, but there's an almost planned mess that you run into in Protestantism, whereas in Catholicism we're kind of trying to fix it.
It's a very orderly mess, but we are all but none of us can brag that we've overcome sin. We all need the Lord more, but whether Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, more Jesus, please, because none of us, we need to model it better. All of us do. So let's go to Emma in Hayden, Idaho, listening on the Catholic Answers app. Emma, your question for Doug.
Hi. My church is not a circus. I just wanted to say that. I'm Protestant. And I'm Italian, so I have all of my family's Catholic. I'm so nervous.
Oh, we're okay.
Well,
at least your picture isn't on the screen.
Plus, we also brought you in right after the most combative words of the hour, so don't worry.
I know. Good gravy.
Sorry about that, Emma. Go ahead. You're safe. We're not going to tag you.
I've been listening for about 5 years now. I've prayed the rosary for a year, really expecting to become a Catholic. It hasn't happened yet. I think the reason that I haven't crossed over is because of the Catholics that I know. Because my cousin, for example, has a gay sister, a stepsister. And she says the Catholic Church is old-fashioned, and you don't have to go to church every Sunday. It's not a mortal sin. And so she calls herself, and this is the majority of the Catholics I know, call themselves cafeteria Catholics. And the other thing is, like, growing up with all my family and friends Catholic, the idea was you could sin all you want, and then you go to confession, and then you're absolved. And the only Catholic family that I know that is really, truly on fire for God is their Vatican I. And I'm very impressed with their family. And maybe I'm just not getting a good example, but when you have, close family members that are taking the faith and kind of waving it in the wind, it makes me wonder, because I look at my church and I see people who are sold out for God.
Well, I don't know. You're definitely not getting a good example, but you might be getting an accurate example of the current state of the Catholic Church in many places. So I certainly wouldn't be the one to deny it. But Doug, your response.
Well, first, thank you so much for calling in, and I'm nervous too. So, thank you for braving the airwaves. First of all, I just want to say I'm really sorry that that's been your experience. It is not unusual. I remember the band DC Talk. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. I'm probably dating myself, but years ago on one of their most popular albums, they had a song that started off with someone saying that the biggest obstacle to Christianity was Christians, and that is kind of ubiquitous. It's just everywhere. One thing that I have noticed as a Catholic is that, number one, I have to really look at who truly represents Catholicism in my decision to be Catholic, and not look at the people that are just kind of hanging out there. And when I look at the lives of the saints and I look at the teachings of the Catechism, sometimes I get a very different picture than what I get on Sunday going to Mass. And what I need to remember is that the difference is that, Catholics can't just go off and make their own church. And when I said it's a circus out there, I don't mean that each individual church is a circus. What I mean is Protestantism is a circus. There's so many different beliefs. There's almost nothing you can't believe or do that isn't represented by a church somewhere. And so what happens is that you're right. You tend to get more faithful people in Protestant churches because they've chosen a church based on what they already think. So naturally, a church that is 100% people that are only there because they believe that church agrees with them, of course they're going to be more faithful. The typical Catholic doesn't have first, second, third Catholic church. We don't have denominations. So you get 5,000 people in a Catholic church, it's going to be a huge range of from very unfaithful people that are only going there because grandma's going to be mad if they don't, up to the super Catholics that drive everybody else crazy because, they want Mass to be 10 hours long. We all have to go to the same building on Sunday. the masses aren't that different. The parishes aren't necessarily that different. And so what you do end up with is a much larger spectrum of faithfulness.
Emma, thank you for the call. I'm sorry that we Catholics do give scandal, but that will probably be that way until the Lord returns. But well,
he said it would be.
It's a good reminder for Catholics, take seriously the call to holiness. It's a very important part of evangelization, the essential part. Doug Beaumont has been our guest. DouglasBeaumont.com is where you can find him and make contact with him, maybe support his ministry. Evangelical Exodus, Evangelical Seminarians and Their Paths to Rome is the book that we mentioned. Doug Beaumont, thanks very, very much.
Thanks a lot, Cy.
I really appreciate it. And you didn't seem nervous at all. I don't know if you were telling the truth to Emma there, that you were nervous.
I've become a good actor over the years.
Okay, very good. Tomorrow, 2 hours of open forum. Colin Donovan will be here. Tim Staples will be here. And any question you want.